the spending is justified and the spending is going to continue to grow, AMD will be a beneficiary of that. I find the chronology of earnings interesting. What do you think we'll learn from AMD about the future?
Yeah, obviously, the hyperscaler earnings that we have seen so far has laid out the groundwork that all the relevant hardware semiconductor value chain will tremendously benefit because we continue to see the demand cannot, basically there's a supply that cannot compete to meet the demand. So definitely really interesting to see how they're evolving that in terms of their revenue and their addressable market they're seeing, especially for the CPU that can benefit as a core driver of the growth in the inference demand.
AWS CEO Matt Garman was on the show yesterday, and I tried to push him on what the CapEx number for next year will be, whether it will be higher in simple terms. That's on the spending side. On the growth side, also what's driving it, and he was pretty clear it's a shift to inference. Training load's still there, but inference is now the driver. Do you see that in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of companies are highlighting that the mix shift to more inference workload, especially on the back of the growth in the AI agentic workload, has been a boon for the demand in the growth. Not just AWS, I would like to highlight that the same pattern has been seen in the two other important hyperscalers, including Google and then Microsoft as well. It's truly impressive how the three companies have delivered combined 50% rate of growth just this quarter, which was double the rate that we have seen just 5 quarters ago. Very strong validation for AI ROI, continued commitment to spending because they're seeing extended backlog of the customer visibility, which is a really important parameter for the investing in AI.
All three of those, Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, are members of TEKY. If you were going to do a scorecard from last week's earnings across the hyperscalers in the week prior, who came out on top of those three?
Well, it's hard to pick, but I would say Microsoft and Amazon definitely relative to the expectation. This quarter was truly impressive because all the three delivered something much better than expectation. That was pretty impressive in my view. And then I think people have to be comfortable and understand that by nature, this large spending commitment has to be taking place upfront. But over time, you are going to see the tangible numbers flowing through their core businesses. And this quarter was fantastic to prove that point.
Selena, if there's something in aggregate across all of the companies that you track and that you include, it seems to be that demand is still running ahead of supply, be that cloud capacity supply, literal chip supply on the basis of the compute. Is that a good thing? And how long do you sort of see that lasting for?
It's a great thing, but at the same time, it's a balancing act that entire supply chain has to work around to make sure, yes, when there's a strong demand visibility, they have to make sure that they can supply all the necessary components in time so that growth does not taper off. I think it's often underestimated how much amazing job this entire supply chain is doing just to make that happen. For example, the LTA that is taking place in memory space, for example, I think is a great example to make sure that the long trajectory for demand and the growth should be there. And that is something truly different and unprecedented this time.
So let's linger on that for a second. Long-term agreements in memory are atypical against history, right? What's happening, based on the conversations I've had recently with SK Group and as well with Jensen Huang is it's the customer saying, hey, let's do a 5-year deal. That hasn't happened historically. Just again, what does that signal to you? Why is that noteworthy?
It is noteworthy because it basically proves the point that there's an extended visibility from the customer demand, and there's basic preemptive efforts to make that happen so that supply and demand go hand in hand in balance to make that this truly impressive once in a generation growth opportunities is coming from AI. We have to remember that all the visibility is actually coming from the upstream. If you think about TSMC, for example, the largest foundry in the world, I would argue that this is the company that has the best visibility when it comes to customers. And guess what? They just announced committing to additional $100 billion in CapEx to expand in Arizona in the U.S. In conjunction with hyperscalers, I don't think they're spending money blindly. They're talking about they can actually see the demand that can stretch out to the 5 years. That's why why they're committing to spend today, and that's why they need to make sure all the supply chain, including the memory companies, to just pace together to make that supply and demand come in balance.